Deep time. Deep time is measured in units that humble the human instant. Epochs and eons, instead of minutes and years. Deep time is kept by stone, ice, stalactites, seabed sediments, and the drift of tectonic plates. Seen in deep time, things come alive that seemed inert. New responsibilities declare themselves. Ice breathes, rock has tides, mountains ebb and flow, and stone pulses. We live on a restless earth. Robert Macfarlane.
Chapter 3: Evidence. Many geological locations preserve the history of the Earth in natural elements. Dust in the ice, an item swept into cave systems, compressed in rocky soils, and preserved beneath crystal layers. All help reveal the depth of time, teaching us details of ecosystems and climate. One notable place for understanding history is Lake Suigetsu in Japan. Suigetsu is one of 5 shallow lakes formed between volcanic peaks. Its name means moonlight reflecting on water. Legend tells of a wild dragon that made its home among the mountain ridges and in the lakes, bringing protection and harmony to the region. The rugged central island that divides 3 of the lakes looks like a majestic home for such a creature. All the lakes were kept clean and flourished under his care. In time, however, the dragon fell in love and departed to be with a female dragon from the far north. So his home was abandoned, the lakes fell into disrepair, and their waters clouded with silt. Aside from Suigetsu's significance in myth, its importance for geology is that the buried sediments at the bottom of the lake are composed of thin layers, added every year. Many annually laminated deposits are found worldwide. Another example is the Lago Grande di Montecchio, in Italy. Summer and the winter season add 2 distinctive layers of material every year, one lighter and the other dark. The quiet lake surface in summer is a perfect environment for the green-blue algae, known as diatoms. As they die, their bodies drop through the water. Their silicon shells create a bright layer. Meanwhile, rock dust, sand and darker debris accumulate throughout the year. The layers are yearly because the diatoms only thrive in the warmer months of the year. Like the rings on a tree, this created a record of summer and winter layers. Most of these are thin, less than half a millimeter thick. Suigetsu has a shallow inflow from an adjoining lake, meaning the incoming water is clear and sediment-free. That is needed because the yearly layers would be cut up and disrupted by a rapidly flowing river. It also lacks oxygen, with no organisms living in the deeper waters to break up the delicate materials after they are laid down. Some of its layers include material from known historical events. These materials include clay deposited by floods and tephra rock fragments, created by volcanic eruptions in other parts of Japan and as far away as Korea. There are around 30 layers with visible volcanic fragments, and many microscopic layers of ash also exist in cores taken from the lake. The layers also contain pollen from flowering plants. That allows scientists to reconstruct changes in local species of plants and temperatures. Recorded in the layers are recent events, like the digging of a channel to the sea by farmers around 1664. These discoveries cross-check the accuracy of the information dug up. Young Earth creationists have attacked these studies of lake cores. However, researchers made great efforts to accurately record the evidence from the lakebed. High-quality work was vital to their research. Their goal was an accurate timeline for the climate of the whole region. The East Asian monsoon influenced the climate at the lake, and it was also affected by major tropical storms. These events are visible in layers of clay, distributed through the lakebed samples, from floods clouding the waters. The samples show that flooding occurred in repeating rhythms as the climate went through long-term cycles. Cycles appear in patterns in the lake cores, as short as 220 or as long as 2,000 years. The material's radiometric and luminescence dating also confirms that the layers were deposited yearly. So we can be certain that they were deposited consistently in the past, and not all at once. The sediment cores collected from the bottom of Lake Suigetsu contain over 100,000 distinct layers, representing more than 50,000 years of real time from the present, season by season. This is merely an eye blink compared to the life of the planet. It is one example of the evidence that existing creation theories cannot explain, found all over the world. Ice, ash and zircons. It is useful to combine these measurements with other independent sources. These include radiometric dating, the climatic events recorded in tree rings, ice cores which show seasonal changes. Also, ash from volcanic eruptions, and the magnetic changes seen across the sea floor due to the tectonic dance of the continents. The ice cores of Dome Sea, a vast area in the Antarctic, have yearly layers going back 800,000 years. Cores dating to 2.7 million years have been recovered from the Allen Hills in Antarctica, showing the long-term development of Earth's climate through trapped gases and rock dust found in their layers. Some rocks are excellent recorders of the moving layers, an age of Earth's restless geology. They carry tiny histories of nature's cycles. Zircon crystals absorb and contain multiple radioactive elements, allowing scientists to date them, using emission tracks and by measuring the proportions of elements they collect. This is because zirconium has the same electrical charge and about the same size as an atom of uranium. This causes zircons to build up a predictable amount of radioactive material in their outer layers. They can have inclusions of other nearby rocks, preserving more delicate materials as they form. They are also tough. Jewelers use them as diamond substitutes. They can survive being eroded out of softer rocks, being swept up by lava, and then included in new rock formations repeatedly. Each time this occurs, they collect a new coating of material that is added to their outer shell. These layers form a record of events that anyone can measure. Since each layer is newer than the ones below, this provides a way of dating the events that the zircon has experienced. A similar effect happens with diamonds that form on the undersides of continental plates. They record the slow recycling processes of the whole planet. That gives geologists a window into deep time based on tiny markers, recording the forces that form landmasses and join and divide continents. Records of this kind are the reason geologists are certain not only about the age of the Earth, but also about complex ongoing events in its structure. Pacific Island evidence. The increasing erosion of islands in a chain as they are carried away from the volcanic hot spot in the crust where they first erupted is proof of great age. The image shows the Pacific seafloor, with Alaska's pointy island chain over the Aleutian Trench at the boundary of the tectonic plate. To the bottom right are the islands of Hawaii. What is immediately visible is a line of underwater mountains connecting to the Hawaiian Islands. It extends from the Aleutian Trench, off Alaska, to Hawaii, 6,000 kilometers away. A volcanic hotspot generated this range of underwater volcanoes, and the Hawaiian Islands at the still erupting end of the chain. This hotspot is a vigorous upwelling of liquid rock pushing through the moving Pacific plate above. An intense flow of magma from beneath the Earth's crust creates the hotspot, although the origin and structure of these geological oddities are still being investigated. Most volcanoes occur at plate boundaries where the crust is thin. This gives rise to geology like the well-known Pacific Ring of Fire. Hotspots, on the other hand, generate volcanoes in the middle, burning right through the rock of the plate. Many other seamounts and their island chains are caused by hotspots, such as the Galapagos Islands, the Azores, and the Samoan Islands, but it is the longest and best known. In the diagram, you can see many of the points in the chain, with their approximate radiometric age. The oldest islands are in the northwest on the map. Moving in that direction from the big island of Hawaii, we see newly formed or mature islands with steep volcanic cones. Then flatter, sandy islands with eroded cones. Coral atolls form rings around the rims of the seamounts as the now extinct volcanoes erode beneath the waters. Lagoons form over the submerged crater rims. Finally, the entire chain dives underwater, and only the nubs of islands remain, dotting the ocean floor. Geologists can use the progression in the island's ages to time the movement of the Pacific Oceanic Plate towards the northwest. You can see that there is a close relationship between age with the distance to the present location of the hotspot. The bend in the middle of the chain is unusual and still being investigated. Did the hotspot itself shift, due to changes in magma flows around Earth's core, or did the overlying plate deform, or both? In any event, the dating proves that the hotspot is the source of the islands. Loihi, the Hawaiian chain's youngest seamount, is erupting from its top. Currently it is at a depth of 1,000 meters below sea level. It is gradually building what will someday be the successor to the Big Island of Hawaii. Australia has similar chains of extinct volcanoes along our east coast, where a hotspot burned a trail of ancient eruptions. It is a different situation in the Philippines, as those islands were generated where many ancient sea plates collide, and are gradually being recycled into the deep earth, in ocean trenches. The geological region stretching from Malaysia to Taiwan, including the Philippines, is one of the most interesting and complex on Earth. It has traces of lost undersea geological structures that were once huge, but are now swallowed up by time. Its oldest region of seafloor rock was once attached to the northern edges of the Australian plate. This has since moved a long way northwest. Natural reactors. There is too much other evidence to review it all, but here is one additional example that I found convincing. Nuclear reactors were among the most complex machines made by humanity until the development of computers. Apart from enriched fuel, they require other substances. These slow the fast neutrons produced when uranium atoms split, or the chain reaction between the atoms of the fuel will fail. Just the right quality of fuel, the right amount of moderator, the control rods that dampen the reaction, and circulating coolant are all critical to avoid an explosion in a traditional reactor. One fact that has been known since the beginning of the nuclear age is that naturally radioactive uranium cannot create a chain reaction. It is usually found in a form that is only weakly radioactive and is simply not rich enough in the most active isotopes. It takes a lengthy process to extract, refine, and enrich it. Yet, natural reactors did once exist in the Oklo region of Gabon, on the west coast of Central Africa, many geological ages in the past. Geologists agree that the Oklo phenomenon is one of the most amazing and surprising discoveries of the 20th century, made in the domains of geoscience and nuclear physics. The photo is the remains of the one located closest to the surface, now lifted at an angle. Most were found below ground during uranium mining. These reactors started off within 17 deposits of uranium, formed in various places, in what are today the Oklo and Bangam regions. What we visualize when we think of a reactor is something large, but most were lens-shaped concentrations, only a few meters wide and centimeters thick. Just one richer location within much larger uranium ore bodies, surrounded by other rocks. As water invaded the surrounding rock, building up as it dripped through cracks, it slowed the radiated neutrons sufficiently to support slow and steady nuclear fission. As the uranium atoms divided, they produced additional radioactive elements, which further fueled the reactions. The Oklo reactors produced quantities of hazardous plutonium and cesium isotopes throughout time, but most of this long ago decayed to harmless substances like barium. So, how did these reactors work when natural uranium is so weak? To fully understand, we must return to the already mentioned concept of nuclear half-life. True, natural uranium currently does not emit enough energy to split surrounding atoms in a chain reaction. However, as you retrace events back in time, it becomes more likely, since the active concentration doubles with each half-life. The amounts of each uranium isotope is uniform in Earth's crust, so at present, all uranium ore mined contains less than 1% uranium-235. This is the form that powers atomic reactors. Go back 2 billion years, or about 3 half-lives of 700 million years, and that concentration reaches 4 to 5%. That is higher than the 3% currently used as reactor fuel. That would have allowed atomic fission to occur spontaneously, as long as a trickle of water was maintained. To work, the geology must not contain rocks of a kind that can poison the chain reaction by absorbing neutrons. The amount of uranium must not be too large or rich, or it would have vaporized, instead of sustaining a reaction. As a result, just a few examples of such reactors survive today. Although more may be found on other worlds, where conditions were once right, such as on Mars. Great age is not an explanation that traditional creationists can use to explain the reactors. Instead, they claim that God altered a few laws of the universe after creation and then changed them back to current settings, just to explain this particular evidence. That is possible. Any miracle is within God's power. Nevertheless, you would have to ask, why alter the fundamental laws of nature to multiply the rate of atomic decay? It is unreasonable to require a miracle just to save traditional creationist timelines, especially if other facts refute that interpretation. It needs a reason aside from patching a hole in human theories. It would not help with other dating measurements in any event. It is just suggested to explain this evidence. Tinkering with radioactive constants would have caused undesirable effects on our sun. So that alternative is not sensible. Why would the sun be affected by radioactive processes? That is because every star's life is a constant battle between gravity and the surging forces of nuclear fusion. Change this delicate balance, and you risk a collapse, explosion. Or in this case, our otherwise unremarkable sun scorching the inner planets. If you increase radioactive decay by 4 times the amount needed for the reactors to function, then our sun would have been a lot brighter. Like B-class stars, it would have been 40 times brighter and much larger with a surface temperature of more than 15,000 degrees. Disastrous for the whole inner solar system, including our own planet. The Oklo reactors cycled for hundreds of thousands of years, producing the expected amount of decay elements for the type of uranium that would have existed 2 billion years ago. Now, there is a second kind of explanation that traditional creationism uses when cornered by the facts. That is to claim that God created geology pre-made to look old. In this case, making the exact balance of decay elements in the rocks and their structures, in order to make it look, in exquisite detail, as if the rain had been trickling down through the cracked rock, invading the uranium and activating the reactors. God would need to have added the appearance of steam damage as they exploded repeatedly over years and years, cycled between wet and dry climatic periods, and the resulting mess of daughter elements, precisely as if the reactors had really functioned over vast periods. That would be quite a messy deception. In contrast, my proposal adds a cosmic focus to interpreting the Bible and accepts what the evidence is telling us. The Earth and the solar system are ancient, just like our galaxy. Oklo's natural reactors make complete sense in that context. The Bible interprets itself, as does God's other book, Nature. Given these examples alone, any questioning of deep time doesn't make sense. There is far more evidence I could add beyond these discoveries. If reading this makes you uncomfortable or you find it controversial, that likely reflects conservative religion's recent view of science. You may have been told, even in a sermon, that scientists and modern biologists are against the Bible and your faith. The truth is that deep time is real. It is required to understand creation, especially in astronomy and biology. At the same time, complex genetic changes have occurred that only long-term evil and chaos can explain. Plato's and Aristotle's pagan religious beliefs are unreliable guides to understanding nature. It is no accident that nature records the past. The history unearthed by scholars is a record that God intended to exist, exactly as we have discovered it. It shows how everything flows from nature's laws, from the layers on microscopic zircons to continental fissures. Christians ought to respect both revelations of truth, accepting discoveries about nature, even when they differ from our previous assumptions.
There have been enormous extinction events and enormous slow-rolling revolutions that have pushed certain kinds of life into peripheral, boutique niches. Life is also a system, constantly in competition with itself, from predator and prey, to host and parasite, and pathogen to victim. Caleb Schorf.
Predators, parasites, and design. Why does conventional creationism, with its assumption of rigid design, clash with current biology? Because conflict and chaos are built into life at every level. Not as a failure of living systems, but as part of their essential functions. Human beings in our present fallen state are fragile. We require a system of living things to support us, by dying, so we can live. We must cook our food and take shelter from the elements. Our genetics is fragile and full of weird workarounds. It contains fossils in its code, showing evidence of our ancestors' battles against nature, and especially with viruses. Animals and plants also have the same difficulties as we do, or more in many cases. Approximately 40% of living creatures have a parasitic existence and use ingenious and sometimes rare abilities to infest or live off other creatures. There are vast numbers of parasites in nature. As an example, there are almost 1 million helminth species, including parasitic worms, flukes, tapeworms, and nematodes. The diversity of a group of species matches its age because it takes time to radiate out into different forms. Groups like the helminth are exceptionally old and diverse. The abilities needed to be an effective parasite are too complex to evolve quickly and are vital for survival. Many life cycles and methods of attack in parasites are so complicated they rule out small-scale evolution as a possible explanation. Many species cannot reproduce at all without infecting or consuming another creature. To exist, parasites need to have been in contact with their hosts as they evolve together, becoming specialized in just one, or a chain of host creatures. Parasites feed on host species that fight back. Their genes have evolved to evade the host's existing defenses. This occurs in a series of feedback loops that are dependent on both the host and the invaders through millions of generations. The process is called coevolution and is essential for these creatures. Viruses are a ubiquitous kind of parasite. More than 200,000 distinct viral populations feed on the ocean's inhabitants alone. They are a topic I will expand on. They were not created by any loving creator, especially not by the God of the Bible. It also seems improbable that anyone engineered viruses or other parasites. The Bible does not mention genetics or humans influencing animal species, except when breeding for valuable traits in domestic animals. The picture is not an ant giving a termite a ride. The whole creature is a beetle found in Australia's Northern Territory. It mimics a termite by enlarging its abdomen. When fully grown, it can live within a termite mound for the rest of its life, being fed and protected by the colony for free. It's an example of a parasite which has no reasonable explanation without a long coevolutionary history. Other species are still gradually improving their mimicry, like the beetle in the picture that lives in the nests of army ants and feeds off their eggs. There is no plausible reason for either demons or prehistoric scientists to create these damaging and odd species in some lost era, as some creationists have suggested. Such an idea is very strange. Consider sap-sucking insects, blood-sucking ticks, or intestinal worms that live inside particular deep-sea fish or crabs. Why would anyone bother to invent so many strange species that do not affect anything apart from another obscure creature? These are creatures that science has only recently discovered in many cases. There are only two realistic options, given how complex their skills are and their dependency on their prey. Either God intentionally made all of those horrible creatures and their life skills to add to the suffering creation experiences, along with defenses against them. That is possible, but unlikely. Alternatively, they evolved naturally, along with their host species, during the reconstruction of nature after the fall. Their slimy nastiness, coming from the potential evil built into nature's basic laws. What about changes that help animals defend against being eaten? Were these abilities, like deft camouflage, internal poisons, sharp spines, or stinging needle-like hairs, specifically designed? No one, in the conventional theories of creation, has a reason to modify the instructions for animals, plants, fish, or insects to assist their defense. If the goal is to regulate species numbers, these powers are unneeded. Nature will balance life and death, regardless of the skills on either side. Just like the abilities of parasites, they don't make sense without the slow development of many species together, under the pressures of a fallen universe. Some plant eaters have developed their bodies and whole way of life around the need to avoid predators or to increase the cost if attacked. However, the balance of species in an ecosystem constantly changes, and no defensive strategy will survive a fight with an opponent that can swiftly adapt. Adaptive power is essential, even when the failures create a steep price for individuals. Most plant eaters invest in several kinds of defense because they're predators, and even their food is fighting back. Nature evolves without any design or plan, except selfish needs. This ability is powerful, enabling every creature to survive, if given enough time to adjust. Some creatures, on the other hand, were just born to kill. Despite those elongated fangs, the iconic North American Smilodon, which is Latin for knife tooth, was more of an ambush hunter, with a bear-like build. It is thought they would spring from hiding, grapple prey with their forelimbs, hold them down, and then stab with their saber-like teeth, using their well-developed neck muscles to generate the killing force. That nature is messed up has been a point of discussion in the church for centuries. The early Christian, Arnobius of Sycha, writing in the 4th century, decided that the Creator was only responsible for the pretty and useful parts of nature. We deny that flies, beetles, and bugs, dormice, weevils, and moths are the work of the Almighty King. Without incurring criticism, we can be ignorant as to who gave them their beginning, and at the same time maintain that not by the higher God were they brought forth, such useless, pointless, purposeless creatures. Teleology, or the idea that all species were designed with a purpose, is a failed explanation for nature, and was never part of the Bible. It also generates flawed theology, since everything in a creature's genes needs to be explained, even things that work badly or cause damage. A Platonic view of God's creation, where species have a fixed form and purpose, leaves no room for dangerous or parasitic species. Like Arnobius, some creationists agree that nasty species were not designed by any creator. They evolved from shared ancestors sometime after creation. That option assumes that many original species with complex life cycles and skills are possible in a ridiculously short period. While it is true that most insects and fish have short lives, quite a few are as long as animals, so extremely rapid evolution of so many new families of species would not have worked. That also violates the common, constantly repeated, religious claim that evolution is not capable of adding any new abilities and ignores genetic evidence of coevolution and the relationships between species. Yet the issues don't end with predators, parasites, and death. Birth, too, is a problem, for nature is wasteful and cruel to the young. Take, for example, the quoll, mainland Australia's largest surviving meat-eater. Captain Cook collected them during his voyage along the east coast in 1770, and recorded quoll as their local Aboriginal name. At that time, the species of quoll lived on the mainland. Today, there is only one. Although settlers originally called it the native cat, it is really a marsupial of the Dasyurid family. It has some relationship to the Tasmanian tiger, and distantly to kangaroos. They are pretty animals, with fur ranging between reddish-brown to dark chocolate and white spots on the body and tail. Underneath, they have a creamy white belly. Sadly, the quoll lives fast and dies young, usually after only 2 to 4 years. Females have babies after their first year. Males tend to die immediately after their first breeding season. They put every possible effort into having offspring. The males are what's known as suicidal reproducers, just like their cousins the Antechinus. As they stop eating and sleeping, and fight other males, their health is badly affected, making them easy prey. That fate is built into their genes. Because they are marsupials, their young are born tiny and undeveloped, and only 6 millimeters long. There are between 15 and 30 babies born at a time. They must crawl across their mother's belly to one of only 6 nipples. There, they will attach, dangling under her belly, and gradually develop. The 6 who connect to a nipple first will live and later transfer to riding on her back until they are large enough to hunt for themselves. However, many of these will not make it to adulthood. Life is unforgiving to the young and inexperienced. Any quoll babies that arrive late, after all 6 nipples are taken, dies without access to food. Efforts to save the quoll are ongoing, but their status remains endangered. The quoll is typical of the wasteful nature of reproduction. Organisms spread their seed without thought or plan. The plant kingdom can be even worse, as anyone afflicted by spring pollen knows. Mothers suffer as well. Scientists believe an Australian lizard endures what could be the world's worst pregnancy. Pregnant stumpy-tailed lizards must gestate a giant baby, weighing more than a third of their weight without being able to swell up, or use extra body space, due to limits imposed by their bones and scales. Growing this massive baby is akin to a woman giving birth to a 7-year-old child. Breathing, eating, and moving becomes nearly impossible for this poor lizard. While not as terrible as that pregnancy, flaws in reproduction also apply to us. Tragically, most human conception ends in an early miscarriage. The affected women are not even aware that a potential baby existed at all. They experience its death as merely a heavy period. That is because we have a larger than usual number of weakened and defective embryos compared to other species. The reason for this is not fully understood. The inner surface of the womb, where embryos usually attach, actively prevents any connection, blocking the growth of such damaged ones. The chemical bargaining between the embryo and its potential mother fails. Depressing as this is, the embryo's defects would likely cause it to die anyway, just later in its development. This gatekeeping is natural, since humans devote much time to raising our offspring, and layers of filtering before a baby can be born helps keep the species healthy. Every living creature needs instincts and skills to stay alive, killing and avoiding death from each other. Knowing how to survive with different behaviors and abilities like herding, spraying toxic chemicals at attackers, or just tasting bad. That life forms that had, up till then, only lived on plants, were now equipped with fang and claw and defensive spikes and chemicals, was in this traditional timeline not just a lucky coincidence. The process had to have been instant. God needed to remake each species to fit it into the new balance. Creating predators, without providing their prey some defense, would have been unfair, and a lot of ecological collapse and extinction would have occurred. He must have altered every species' digestive processes and internal chemistry. As if that individual creature had lived in a death-connected way, for their entire existence and their ancestors had too. Suppose things did happen as described. All these miracles must have been completed well before the flood, and likely at the time of the fall. Forcing this shocking and terrible job on God is our only choice. That is, if we must reject science to support a history with traditional handmade species and brief timing. The assumption that all of these events were natural changes occurring in a short time is incorrect. Evolution cannot be that powerful. It is ironic that traditional creationists choose to believe in amazingly effective and rapid evolution. That is something that has never been observed in nature. It would have required intense guidance by God to avoid everything going extinct in any case. Such changes are the only valid explanation if the traditionalists are correct. Fortunately, we know that God is good, so they must be entirely wrong. An alternative Genesis. Historians credit Thomas Chalmers, born in 1780, a renowned Scottish theologian and the first moderator of the Free Church of Scotland, with first promoting the idea of a gap in Genesis. Chalmers became fascinated by science and gathered the books of numerous geologists, including James Hutton. His studies led him to believe that the world was at the least millions of years old. He tried to reconcile the geological facts with his faith. In particular, he wrestled with explaining geology within the brief events of the Bible. He solved the problem by proposing a massive gap between Genesis' first and second verses. He did not promote this much in his writing, but his solution inspired many Bible students who followed him. More recently, Scofield promoted the gap hypothesis in his study Bible. Scofield writes in his comments on Genesis that God's first recorded creation can explain Earth's ancient geology. Thomas Chalmers first lectured to his theology students about his gap solution in 1814. That decade was an early one for science. It included the founding of the first Geology Society in London, for example. However, discoveries over the following 2 centuries would reshape everyone's ideas about nature. Science has made the idea of a gap or some better solution relevant to every Christian's views. There is overwhelming evidence of the universe's immense age, just ask any astrophysicist. Due to this history and problems with a traditional view of Genesis, some Christians prefer alternative explanations for deep time. The common ones are the day-age and the gap theory. Both ideas have been officially rejected by my own church, which is committed to a literal 7-day creation, as part of a Sabbath-focused theology. I think their value as explanations is doubtful, but many Christians consider them useful alternatives. These theories connect faith and science, but downplay the accuracy of Scripture. By adopting them, believers can explain millions of years of history, during or before, the 6 days of creation. It is worth looking at how both theories arose, and why some Christians accept or reject them. Thomas's answer came from a detailed study of the Hebrew, of the first and second verses of Genesis, and other events that might have occurred before creation. The text seems to hint at a pause after verse 1, then something transforming. In Thomas's explanation, earth was created, and then by the second verse, it had become dark, chaotic, and entirely wet. That implied a creation, followed by complete destruction. Finally, there was a replacement creation, constructed over 6 days. Some think the damage was due to the fall of Lucifer, as the devil had been, at some unknown time before creation, cast to the earth. The gap assumes that God reused existing matter throughout Genesis, because we can see fossils from the previous creation everywhere. That is the story of the Genesis gap. There is a first creation, the devil is cast down. Then there are eons of suffering, and a judgment and destruction of a corrupted world. All in just 2 verses. It is like the solution in this book, but limited to a single planet. The best interpretation of the gap includes recent forms of life like dinosaurs, which helps explain more of the fossil record. It assumes that someone, or something, corrupted that early world because it contained conflict and death from its beginning, and then a catastrophe left it barren and nearly lifeless. Is Schofield correct that a gap can explain geology? For a gap to be a functional explanation, there must have been many millions of years of evolution, destruction and natural recovery, repeated many times before the events of Genesis. Since it wasn't God corrupting nature, the devil must have been interfering with life over these periods. Finally, the flood generated a few additional layers on top of all that. This argument is reasonable as far as it goes. A useful explanation must fit the creation sequence envisioned by the writer of Genesis. It should agree with God's other explanations in the Bible. In addition, 1814 was before modern geology and physics. Any factual theory of creation must explain 21st century science. That should include, for example, human genetics, the solar system, and chaotic natural physics. The gap solution does not appear to handle both sides of that challenge. It is trapped between satisfying the scientific evidence and following the Bible's events. For example, the sun and moon are created on day 4 of Genesis. Since the pre-existing world certainly had a working sun and moon, the gap theory has a problem with these verses. Living worlds do not develop or function without a sun. The gap theory is also morally dark. It includes repeated destruction of thriving ecosystems and intense animal suffering for long ages of time. Much of Earth's life is more the devil's work than God's. It suggests that God remade the Earth's surface by smashing it with a gigantic rocky asteroid. Those dinosaurs must have been especially wicked, but their doom took many millions of years to arrive. You would expect the Creator to do something to defend nature even without humans in it. The devil is not a sufficient explanation for this moral darkness. As it does today, biology before Genesis required death and suffering to function. The fossil evidence is clear on this point. In addition, this theory requires that God reuses existing abused and damaged life in his replacement creation. After all, life today belongs to the same genetic families found in fossils. Any gap is rejected by Christians who believe in a direct creation. They cite verses such as, "By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. And he spake, and it was, he commanded, and it stood fast." And the message of Exodus chapter 20, God spoke all these words. In 6 days, God made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. So there was no existing Earth or creatures before the 6 days of Genesis unless long ages are somehow part of day 1. Adjusting the Bible's meaning in many different verses to fit a recreation of the Earth is not really acceptable. God does not need to remix existing matter or biology to create a world, so the gap theory needs to provide some reason why he chose that option. There isn't a geological divide between the world before Genesis and the present. Nothing in the fossil record shows a complete gap or break. Genetically, there is no change between the creatures mentioned in Genesis and long-extinct ones. While if a gap did occur, the Bible's creation account ought to have included at least some details of such a major interruption to God's plans. More than just a pause between two verses. There should be a verse or two noting that great geological ages had passed. Cutting back on the theory's scientific claims does not help either. Even a pre-existing barren world, with no life, needs to work around the Bible verses I've listed. On the other hand, removing life from the gap theory makes it scientifically weak and causes it to reject key evidence. Life on Earth has an impact that extends beyond the surface. Living creatures have changed Earth's geology and atmosphere over long periods. They grow in and modify deep geology in ways no flood can explain, influencing whole geological cycles. They change Earth's crust as it cycles carbon to and from the surface, adding oxygen to its atmosphere, eroding the rocks, and removing iron from its seas in thick layers of rust. Any creation theory needs to include life's deep history to explain geology. The story of the Genesis gap ends with terrible destruction, leaving the planet nearly dead. However, the extinction of the dinosaurs was not Earth's first or last catastrophe, or even its worst. The worst would be the Permian-Triassic extinction event, known as the Great Dying. The Permian era saw the origin of innovative, early mammal-like reptiles and reached levels of oxygen higher than today, but ended with extreme changes to the climate and an extraordinary 96% of all plants and animals on the planet dead. Even if you accept a gap at the end of the age of dinosaurs, that doesn't provide a solution. Existing life didn't appear fully formed after the dinosaurs died. It developed from tiny mammalian and bird survivors of the asteroid that struck at that time. The survivors left a trail of fossil descendants leading to today's species. For example, the long history of the whales as they transformed from land animals to seagoing giants. These key events will be the focus of a later chapter. Scientists say more than 5 mass extinctions are clear in the fossil record, all with different causes and duration. Even between these significant disasters, life experienced regular boom and bust cycles. That led to extinctions seen through the history of oxygen generation and use. Also, there were large extinctions of mammals after the age of the dinosaurs. So believers in a gap must suspect that God created and then destroyed life again and again to generate the world we know. Life is more unstable and suffers more than many Christians think. As geologist Charles Lyell wrote in 1837, amidst the vicissitudes of the Earth's surface, species cannot be immortal, but must perish, one after another, like the individuals which compose them. There is no possibility of escaping from this conclusion. Is the second option, the day-age idea, preferable? In that theory, each day of creation should be around 2.28 billion years long. If each day is of equal length, so Genesis should include the history of contemporary life only in the final segment of the last day. That obviously doesn't work. When you start with the Big Bang, the day-age explanation fits better. If you imagine the ocean in Genesis as plasma and darkness and chaos as highly compressed and interwoven primordial forces, light does arise next. There was a lot of light, followed by stars and, ultimately, planets. That last component took some time. The stars had to form, fuse together all the atoms needed, besides hydrogen, explode and be reborn several times to make them. Unfortunately, despite that promising start, the explanation veers off course. Even if you believe that the days mark major events, rather than being periods of time, this approach excludes nearly everything vital from the Bible's events. It explains nothing about the Earth, other than its great age. If the day-age theory is correct, then the Bible is wrong about the timing of the creation of the sun and moon, for example. Biologically, there are only descriptions of modern species that the writer was familiar with in Genesis. So it fails to explain any biological history. Overall, this modern myth-making does not uphold the Bible or add anything predictive to science. It doesn't really fit them together at all. Does either of the gap theories explain the formation of the planets? Each planet has specific features that conventional science explains well. For example, the leftovers from the formation of the solar system that surrounds it with waste material like the asteroids. There are also planets affected by impacts. This includes oddities like Uranus with its rings and more than 27 moons. Many of them captured over time from gigantic passing debris. The God described in these alternatives is, at best, negligent. At worst, he intentionally causes suffering, pushing the development of species. Day-age theories treat the days of Genesis as vast periods of time in a sequence unrelated to their order, or as poetry disconnected from any real history. The problem with both options is that evil afflicts every species throughout deep time. This results in billions of years of violence, predation, survival of the fittest, victory of the weak over the strong, extinction, disease, famine, and death, death and more death. Life made to kill and live off the suffering of others, exactly as it does today. To get around this problem, some believe that the pain of animals and natural evil itself is unimportant. Being egotistical about their own species, they prefer to think that God only notices human evil. Refusing to believe that animals or nature itself can experience corruption or injury. Genetic sequences demonstrate that current species are connected to extinct ones all the way back to the origin of life. This is not explained by any alternative like a gap. If either gap alternative is true, then we have to accept that God created the world's creatures with virus-infected and faulty instructions. That would build death into the universe as an essential part of its design, instead of being a result of sin, and that unfairly blames the Creator. The alternatives presented all have significant flaws. In response, some Christians abandon the Bible as a source of knowledge. They prefer a purely scientific explanation. That is also a risky alternative. Science's assumptions erase God from history. They are left with only a sliver of faith and belief in a God without any role in his universe. They may think God is hidden, so much that only traditions and pleasant feelings show he exists. Many feel that only love matters, that belief is unimportant. There is no need to explain the damage seen in creation that causes humans and everything else to be so broken. God's creation is pure and good just because they feel it must be, in spite of all the evidence. All Christians have a problem they need to recognize. It exists within either the scientific or biblical evidence about nature. This potential conflict affects everyone, from orthodox creationists to those who think Genesis is a fable. Cosmic creation shows the larger context of Genesis. It is a powerful approach to resolving either difficulty.